Yeah. Negative.
I just put the YouTube go live. I just clicked on it. Yeah. Now we're live.
We're good.
We're good. Yes, we're live and we're streaming.
Good evening. This is the Wednesday, October 19th Technical Advisory Committee. I'd like to welcome everyone here and live. And first order of business is summary notes. And since I was not here last month, I need to abstain. But Mr. Cicerelli, no, take a roll on the vote for the minutes of last month. Armand?
Mm-hmm.
That's you. Take a roll.
Has everybody reviewed it?
Oh, absolutely.
Anybody have a motion to accept?
Motion to accept.
Second? Second? Vote? Aye.
Abstain.
Passes.
It passes. Thank you. That moves us right into Mr. Jasper. Would, give us a status of the transaction.
Okay. So in September, we're just coming off of the public comment period, so we gave you a quick rundown on that. And this evening, we want to give you our final feedback on proposed enhancements to the draft plan project list. Have included in your packet as reference slides a fairly lengthy summary of the public comments, which we're happy to go over in detail if you'd like us to. But they are in the packet if you want to skip through them. We really wanted to focus more on item 3 this evening.
Yeah.
So they're there if you want. So going to the overview, slide 4, this and the following 4 slides are what I would call an essential refresher of what transaction is, what it is not, some key takeaways, and what happens if you endorse this plan when we ask you to do that next month. And we will ask the authority in December to adopt the plan. So in the event that those things all happen, I'll just quickly go over what the implications of that would be. So starting with what transaction is, I know this is probably very familiar territory for all of you, but I do feel as though I need to bring you all to the same place because we want to actually carry some of these themes through, or to make sure these themes come out of the final draft of the plan. So it's a long-range plan, horizon year 2045, 429 multimodal candidate projects whose performance as a whole has been evaluated with respect to congestion reduction and other factors using the 10 weighted performance measures you may recall were approved by NVTA in November and December of 2021, and which went through a fairly lengthy process with this committee in the second half of 2021. So that is what we've used for evaluating projects in transaction. The 2 favorite expressions that we have that we sometimes assume that everyone understands, so I'm not going to make that assumption, is fiscally unconstrained, and that's intentional. And what that means is it contains more projects that could be reasonably funded by NVTA or the entire region, most likely, through the horizon year of 2045. But that is intentional because the projects are focused on the needs, not on the funding that's available for the projects. It's also geographically unconstrained, meaning that, again, intentionally it includes projects that are beyond Northern Virginia, but they've been included because if they are funded, they would support the plan's vision and goals. Perhaps, just from an administrative point of view and from a necessary legal point of view, transaction as we have developed it is compliant with the Code of Virginia, which is the overarching legislation that we have to adhere to. And what that means is there's a mandate for NVTA to produce this plan within the Code of Virginia. There's also language that makes it a prerequisite for the projects that are selected for funding. And there's also, among many other pieces of legislation, there's a piece of legislation from 2012 referred to as HB 599, the House Bill 599, which kind of set out some parameters for how NVTA goes about evaluating projects, and those that the principles of HB 599 are integrated into transaction as well as into our 6-year programming work as well. Transaction is not a land use plan, although it does incorporate COB's cooperative planning forecasts. We have always acknowledged the linkage between land use and transportation and vice versa. But this is not a land use plan, it's a transportation plan. And our member jurisdictions would not thank us if we try to make it a land use plan, because that is the prerogative of local jurisdictions, not the regional body like us or even the state. It is not a road building plan, as has sometimes been referred to. It is a multimodal plan. It is not a funding document and does not commit NVTA to funding any project that's in this plan. NVTA's funding process, as you know, is a 6-year program. That's where funds are allocated to projects. No such thing is happening within transaction. The 6-year program is a completely separate, related, integrated process, but it is separate from transaction. And transaction is not a project or modal prioritization or ranking tool, but it does provide information that could be used for project evaluation purposes. So a couple of pages of key takeaways. Transaction provides our jurisdictions and partner agencies with a diverse range of multimodal project options. The 429 projects, that's what they can, that's what become eligible for future funding cycles through our 6-year program. And subject to project funding, through the 6-year program updates, we consider the transaction supports its vision and goals being mobility, accessibility, and resiliency, and fully takes account of NVTA's core values of equity, sustainability, and safety. The project list, as stated in the document, and we can flash this up on the screen as well if anyone wants to see it in detail. It is multimodal, and the largest group of projects by cost in transaction are transit, with just under $45 billion worth of estimated costs. The next largest group is roadway intersections, interchanges, HOV, HOT, and parking combined at just under 30 million. And then much smaller amounts, but no less important, than non-motorized projects and technology and travel demand management projects. A key takeaway in the plan is the regional BRT system that's called out. I'm calling that out because such a system will provide alternatives to driving alone, while anticipating that metro rail improvements will come, but they're on a much longer timescale, probably longer timescale than even 2045, to be realistic. Obviously, the region can't wait until then to address its transportation needs. The region doesn't particularly want to continue dependency on driving alone, although it's likely to remain as a major part of the way people get around the region. But we consider that a regional BRT system, which kind of looks to scale up the individual lines that are currently being developed, and in some cases operated in the region, to something that is kind of akin to Metro Rail or VRE on a regional system-wide basis, but a bus-based system. And the plan also identifies how transportation technologies can be leveraged as we go forward. Continuing from funding initiatives that have already taken place, the plan itself essentially integrates our transportation technology strategic plan. It embraces potential expansion of RM3P, which is the regional multimodal program that NVTA is jointly developing with DRPT, and it also supports, or the technology components support, decarbonisation of the transportation system. Other key takeaways. The plan evaluates two scenarios that we consider are external, beyond our control. They're going to happen to us. They're not going to happen because of us. As such, our posture on these two scenarios, the new normal scenario, which is post-pandemic, and technology scenario, which is where aggressive action on electric vehicle infrastructure is outlined. Our posture on these going forwards is that we will be mostly reactive, but as proactively reactive as we can be. And our transportation technology strategic plan is an example of that. It isn't meant to kind of create the environment in which technology will happen in Northern Virginia, so much as to prepare Northern Virginia for technologies that could be supportive or counter to our vision and goals. So proactively reactive is how I describe two of the scenarios. The third scenario, however, incentives and pricing, is one where if governments at all levels are proactive, I say government at all levels, including NVTA, in a coordinated way, that scenario would be supportive of the region's vision and goals, but it would be complex and it would be challenging, but it would have impact, and potentially a lot of that impact could occur without spending much, if any, of the 75 billion that's associated with the 429 projects that are in the plan. So say that because we've consistently said there isn't $75 billion anyway, but we have identified something that could achieve much of, if not more than, the 75 billion projects could achieve, but it would be very difficult to implement. If there's a region in this country where it could happen, Northern Virginia is probably one of those, because the region is already familiar with the concept of variable pricing for congestion. It's already familiar with the concept of using revenues from congestion pricing to reinvest in the transportation system and other modes. And obviously we have problems that are challenging, that need perhaps creative out-of-the-box approaches. So we're paying close attention to what's going on in New York City and New Jersey as they move forward with their congestion pricing program. We're not saying that's a model for NVTA or this region, but I think there'll be important lessons learned that could potentially be applicable down the road. I want to draw those distinctions between the three scenarios. The two that are external, beyond our control. There's one that will only happen with a high degree of government intervention. And so I just kind of understand the scenario analysis in that way. We've been asked what success would look like with respect to transaction, and that's a good question, and it will vary depending on where you are in the region, because the region is diverse, is not homogeneous. We acknowledge as mentioned earlier, the interrelationship between land use and transportation, and we build upon COG's planning forecasts to that end, and the compliance with the Code of Virginia. So that are takeaways, and if endorsed and subsequently adopted, again, transaction will provide that range of multimodal options for member jurisdictions and other eligible applicants who are seeking funding from NVTA. And it will provide the initial eligibility for any such applications after it's been adopted, at least for the projects that are wholly within Northern Virginia. You mentioned that it's geographically unconstrained, so there are projects outside of Northern Virginia. Any project that's partly in Nova and partly elsewhere could be eligible for partial funding from NVTA, providing those satisfactory funding arrangements in place with partner agencies outside of Nova. And there is some precedent for having done that in the past. But we cannot see any way that we can fund projects that are entirely outside Nova, even if they're in the plan. That's not going to happen. That would probably be illegal. And we hope that transaction will provide further analytical information to support the evaluation of candidate projects for our 6-year program updates. I don't mean to belabor that. I know a lot of it is old ground for you, but these are very important things that we need to sprinkle through the document. They are already in the document. We don't believe we've done the finest job we could have done in telling that story in the way I've just outlined it to you. So as we move forward over the next couple of weeks in preparation for November, we're going to be taking another look to make sure that messaging comes through in the plan, possibly in the form of little sidebar quotes or whatever. Happy to pause on that if you've got any questions before I go into the actual, well, actually, next I'll go into the feedback from the other committees.
Question? Eddie? Hearing none. Commissioner Beveridge.
Thank you. Okay, so the next 4 slides go over the feedback we got from you and other committees and the authority in September and the first part of October. So just a refresher for you, at your meeting on September 21, we had these questions or comments that were raised, mostly questions. I'm not going to go through them line by line unless you want me to, but this is all helpful for us to kind of understand, particularly as you were the first in the cycle, get your initial reaction on what you thought about the plan or questions about what was included in the plan. And certainly some of these questions will reflect themselves in the way we change the document.
Did anybody want to go in depth on any of those?
The next committee was the Planning Coordination Advisory Committee, which met a week after you did. Again, I won't go through these in detail. The first one was very specific to Western Loudoun County, and actually wasn't really that specific to transactions, it turned out, because transactions are planned, it doesn't get into environmental impacts of projects. A question that came up several times in other committees was to do with a 54% reduction in emissions that's shown on page 17 of the document, which attracted some comment as to what that was based upon. I think we would recognize that there's probably some confusion about the way that was presented. So I'll come to this in just a moment, but we're going to address that particular point specifically going forward. And then the final comment here really from the PCC, from one of the county supervisors, in fact, was why would we even think about spending 75 billion on all these projects if the scenario results showed us that the impacts could be achieved or improved upon without spending any of that money. Without belaboring the scenario point again, the thing you have to remember is the scenarios are not predictions of the future. They are what if exercises in the event that COG's planning forecasts are not the best representation of the future that actually happens in 2045. So the 3 scenarios we looked at were things that we considered to be plausible, but not predicted, and certainly not expressing any preference or as to what direction the region should go in. They were simply an assumptions-based set of alternative futures that we looked at. And so the answer to this question really is just that. It's like it's not an either or. You can't say, okay, we can spend this money or we can have the scenario. We don't get to pick the scenario in 2 cases, and in the 3rd case, we can pick it, but it's complex, challenging, all the other things I've mentioned to do with incentives and pricing. It's an option. I wouldn't say it's an easy option. It's an option. The Planning and Programming Committee had more to say, and I think that's probably because they had more time to kind of be kind of prepared for the conversation. And so you can see their comments here, which in some cases were not necessarily comments about the plan, although in some cases there were, but I think part of it was kind of looking at the messaging as much as looking at the content of the plan. Having said that, there were some really in the details kind of comments like, what's the definition of build and no build? What's in the no build? And we accept there's confusion when we use jargon terms like build and no build, particularly in this case, because no build actually does include building some projects, specifically projects that are already in the works and fully funded, if not already being built, like Silver Line, Phase 2, I-66, and so on. So we need to do a little bit more work, step back from the jargon, look at this through the eyes of the intended audience, as opposed to the authors, and try and make it a bit more understandable. So we accept that criticism. At its meeting on October 13th, we gave NVTA the opportunity to react. Obviously, with this timeline, as each meeting came and went, we had more information available to share, and our own thinking was developing further, and so the conversations became deeper as we went through the cycle. So at NVTA, we revisited that 54% bar in the chart on page 17. That was of concern to some authority members, but again, there was some more high-level messaging. Authority members wanting to make sure that, regardless of whether the comments are positive or negative, but particularly if they're negative, we need to make sure those comments have been heard and where possible addressed. There was talk about environmental goals. Are we moving the needle in the right direction? I think really we would come back to the point that transaction is not a funding document. So in and of itself, transaction does not move the needles. It's the implementation of some of the projects in transaction which will achieve that, and that's all still in the future. And again, comments from several members that the reasons diversity is reflected in the plan, but at the same time, we can't solve all the problems of Northern Virginia in one long-range transportation plan for one entity like NVTA. So I guess kind of telling us to keep a sense of balance. We cannot be the answer to everything. So again, I'm happy to take a pause and any questions you may have on comments raised from other bodies in this process.
Keep moving on, man.
So we come to the actual, our current position as of a couple of days ago, when we sent this out to you, we were still working on it at the very beginning of this week, and I apologize for the late distribution, but that's just been the nature of the kind of the moving target here. So the proposed enhancements that we're talking about here kind of break down into a number of areas, and I'll just try and step through these as clearly as I can. So section 6 of the plan talks about the impacts of the plan, basically the results of that evaluation using the 10 weighted performance measures. And on page 17, mentioning the chart here, whether you could perhaps put this on the screen. So you can see that there's one of the measures, the F1 measure, which is the vehicle emissions measure. Actually, there are 2 bars in this chart, and that's the cause of some confusion. See, towards the bottom there, we've got an F1 emissions reduction bar with the electric vehicle improvements, and the one below it is with the current EV rate. So the calculation of the reduction on emissions in this case is particularly dependent on what's going on in the region with respect to what others are doing with electric vehicle infrastructure and vehicles. We do have projects in transaction, so but at the 1.7% increase in emissions is kind of really looking at the impacts without much in the way of EV infrastructure improvement, and the 54% reduction in EV emissions, in emissions is due to kind of like the kitchen sink approach of dealing with electric vehicle infrastructure and vehicles and so on. So we kind of presented a range there, and some felt we were taking credit for something we shouldn't take credit for. I don't think we were taking credit for something inappropriately, but we perhaps didn't explain well enough what this actually meant. There is also on this page a blue call-out box, which if you scroll down a little bit more, it's a rather large call-out box. And it does, and the other text does kind of explain the meaning behind these bars, but you know, the fact that a number of committees raised this, as well as the authority raised this with us, tells us that we're not doing the best job we could in explaining it. So
Should it be a separate section? Now, if EVs control the world, this is what would happen as a separate, and you could explain that.
we could,
As opposed to the side by side, which kind of mixes in with water.
yeah, we could do that. It becomes almost part of the scenario analysis at that point,
Right.
which is not really what this part of the document is addressing. As I mentioned to you before, the electrification stuff is part of the technology scenario, which is one of those two scenarios over which we have no control. And I think my big regret here, as I look at it now, compared to when I looked at it back in July when we were putting the public comment packet together, was we've inadvertently caused a lot of focus on this, to the detriment of the pricing and incentives scenario, which is the one of the three that can be controlled. And what we want to try and do here is address concerns that people have about the way this is represented, but also refocus the discussion much more on pricing and incentive scenario,
Right.
because NVTA doesn't really have control over this. COG doesn't, most of the jurisdictions don't. You know, it's going to depend upon what motor manufacturers do, it's going to depend upon what consumers do, and it's going to depend upon, you know, a lot of federal money flowing into EV infrastructure and how that gets distributed around the state and what it's used for. Yeah, so there's multiple things that are going to be affecting things here.
I'm not into it with the document as it is, but if we, I don't know if you thought about just separating that, the scenario we can't control as a separate section.
I'll come to that in a moment.
I don't mean to put a grenade into the middle of it.
No, you're not. You're
That's
not
gonna
actually.
blow
You're
the
not.
whole thing up.
Because we've been going through the same thought process ourselves. But this one does need to be addressed, and most likely the way we're going to address it is to take that 54% bar out, reword that page accordingly, and then kind of, like I say, shift the balance between how much we talk about this versus other things in the plan.
Keith, was the assumption about the proportion of the fleet that was electric in a base scenario, or was it only in one of the variant scenarios?
Tom, do you want to address that? Sure. It's Tom Harrington from Cambridge.
So, yeah, I think the 1.7% is when both the no build and the build have the same electrification assumption. And as stated there, it's with current EV usage is what was the assumption. And that gives you a little bit of an increase, 1.7% increase, because BMT also goes up based on that mix of projects in 429. The 54% is when you've got today's EV in the no build, but then you have full EV adoption in the build. And so that's why there was that. As Keith said, that's really giving you bracketed of what we think can happen. A little bit of increase or drop.
Was your base build or, you know, run for whatever the design year is? Did that include that high proportion of EVs?
When you say base build run.
Well, whatever.
2045 build
Yeah,
didn't include the high rate of EV, but that's when you get 1.7%.
so shouldn't that then only be reported in a scenario analysis?
Yeah.
That's a discussion we are having.
Yeah.
We try to show that this is the range that can happen.
There is one wrinkle, which is that there are 3 projects on the project list of the 429 that are specifically EV infrastructure. So the issue is if you know, if we assume like in 2045 we maxed out EV use, We want to leave some room to show that there could be benefits if NVTA invests in EV infrastructure. So that was one of the considerations at the time, was that there are projects. I think the comments were that you can't say that those 3 projects cause the full 54%, which, as Keith said, there are many factors which will lead to adoption.
But if I may, that 1.7% increase, as we said, doesn't change the rates. It's as of today. The 54% reduction reflects a whole lot of other things, plus the 3 projects that is in the plan. What you are not seeing here is what is those 3 projects alone can do. It's very difficult for us to predict it that way because those are EV. We cannot really predict the EV adoption rate just because of those 3 projects.
But somehow you made some assumption about what proportion of the VMT would be by electric vehicles.
In the full bill,
In the full
2045, I
bill.
mean, full electrification.
Yeah, and we can explain what the basis of those assumptions were. I mean, they were very considered assumptions, but based on other research that was being done, not just numbers we made up. But you know, as Tom and Shriva was saying, you know, it's hard to know for sure what the base and the future penetration rates of EVs will be at that time, because that itself is also dependent upon so many other things that cannot be known at this time.
So if you just come back on that. One thing I always get, it's difficult to explain again, is that 1.7% increase that you are seeing doesn't include the impacts of the 3 NVTA projects that have EV infrastructure. So if we include the impact, I agree that it's very difficult to figure out what is the impact of only those 3 projects. But if those projects have some impacts, obviously should have some impacts, will that 1.7% increase reduce to, I don't know, 1%, 0, or will it become negative 1.7%? We don't know. But that impact is not captured in these charts.
So the fact that we're having a discussion on this is further evidence that this particular issue is distracting from things that we should be focusing very much. I appreciate the discussion. It's very appropriate to have it, but it just makes the point that I was trying to make earlier. So if I may move on into the next slide, we kind of revisit the whole scenario analysis thing in section 7. And just a word again, when we say scenario analysis, that's the name of the technique that we are using to address uncertainty in long-range transportation planning. We do it through a series of scenarios that we define. We make assumptions, we convert those assumptions into proxy measures within the model, and then the model can basically evaluate the alternate futures that each of the 3 scenarios represent. So that's why it's there. Whether it deserves its own section, as it currently has in the plan with about 3 pages devoted to it, is something we're reconsidering, because it's a sensitivity analysis of the main results that are shown in section 6. We're wondering whether we should just make it the scenario analysis a subsection of sections.
Put it at the end.
Well, it already is at the end. But I mean, we don't really want to have, you know, appendices in the plan, but they'll all get pushed to the text memo that will come later. So we're still really dancing around this one a little bit, but we want to make sure that we improve the communication of the content. That's the real point here we want to get across. You know, what the scenario analysis is and what it's not. Particularly to mention that we're not evaluating different packages of projects in the scenarios. Packages of the projects stay the same in each scenario. It's just the kind of like the environmental circumstances in 2045 are different in each scenario, and that's what makes the difference between them. And we also think that it may be appropriate, because this, apart from within the consultant and NVTA team, where we're all fascinated by this stuff, we think our egos maybe are getting the better of us and it would be better to spend less time talking about how we do scenario analysis and more time talking about what it told us, on the basis that a majority of the readers of this document will hopefully trust us that, you know, our black box is reliable, and we have used it appropriately, but we can spare them the details of what we did and focus more, like I say, on what we learned. And in that way, I think we can better emphasize. So we're thinking actually more of a tabular summary of what the scenario is, what we learned, and what it means going forward for each. And again, drawing out the distinction between the two scenarios that are subject to external influences and the one that is solely dependent upon multiple layers of government, you know, in intervention. And we're also considering here, you know, in deference to the comments that we made about why do you not talk about land use? Some of you may recall who were with us 5 years ago when we went through this process, we actually did do some scenarios with land use, where we kind of took a bookend approach, as Ms. Batman called it, where when you look at the delta, the growth that's expected between, you know, then, current, and the future, say, instead of it going where the cooperative forecasts are telling us it's going to go, one scenario could be that that delta growth, 10 or 20% or whatever, will be heavily centered on existing areas, regional activity centers, or areas of concentrated, you know, patterns of growth. So in other words, to force even more of the growth into the areas that are already the most intense in terms of population and employment. And the other bookend was to say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to say none of that growth is going to go into the activity centers. It's going to get distributed around suburban and semi-rural Northern Virginia. And look to see, again, on the basis, these are not predictions or preferences, plausible alternatives that help us understand the robustness of the analysis. This will tell us what the impact was of densification versus distribution. We didn't repeat that analysis this time because we didn't see any need to do it, because in all likelihood, the passage of 5 years won't change the outcome of that analysis. So we're thinking about adding in a footnote to that effect within the discussion on scenarios so that people can understand how, you know, more or less densification of land use might have an impact on the forwards. So that's something we're still mulling over. But it was raised in the comments, and we think there may be some merit in doing that, providing we don't, you know, distract from the key messaging. In section 8, which is where we talk about the regional benefits of the plan, obviously, if we take out section 7, then we'll renumber this to the, you know, new section 7. And we really want to emphasize those major takeaways from the overview slides I presented earlier. To make sure we answer the question, so what? What does transaction actually mean? And be clear that, you know, if there are limitations and external factors we can't control, we say that. And if we can address what success might look like, we'll do that as well. Some general points, you know, just picking up the whole document, does it communicate what transaction is and what we found? Emphasize what it is and what it isn't. We threw this one out here, this new terminology, which the federal government is looking to be using now, to use the expression carbon pollution as an alternate term for emissions or greenhouse gas. We decided we're not going to do this. It's too recent, and we already have a measure that talks about emissions reduction. So creating a new terminology where we don't fully yet understand if there's a difference between carbon pollution and GHG emissions. So we don't want to go there at this time. We do need to look at that a little bit further, right? But we won't change anything in transaction. Mention has been made to us of the environmental goals, which are important, but we must recognise that the COG's environmental goals have been created under a different legislative framework to the one that we must act under. We have to act under the Code of Virginia first. And within our process, the 10 weighted performance measures are what drives our evaluation. That's been approved all the way up to the NVTA. COG's recent goals for reduction in emissions are actually technically referred to as optional. And there are no detailed action plans associated with them anyway at this stage. So we have to understand that they're similar, they overlap, but they're different. Our governing legislation is what we follow, first and foremost. If we can absorb other things in that without falling foul of Virginia law, we'll try and do that. But first and foremost, we have to stay compliant with Virginia code. What I refer to as the beautification of the plan document. Aesthetics aren't everything, but they sure help. And you know, without criticizing the consultant in any way, shape, or form, because they did what they had to do under a lot of pressure, we can make it a little bit prettier, we think, and we will endeavor to do that. And as I mentioned earlier, there's some jargon we need to address. So we're thinking about less code request jargon. That's the changes to the project plan. The project list is going to be largely unchanged, but there are 3 pairs of projects that we thought were actually 6 discrete projects, but it turns out there's 3 discrete projects, and we got some duplication going on. So we're just going to pick one and replace and remove the other, or slightly merge the descriptions so that the 2 projects can become 1 project. And these are such minor changes that no additional model work is needed. It doesn't affect any of the analysis at all. There are a couple of projects where we need to change the project sponsor. Again, doesn't change the evaluation the slightest, but we just need to make it correct. And a couple of places we need to change the project location. In some cases, changing it to multi-jurisdictional. That old problem we have is for some parts of Alexandria and Fairfax, or some would say some parts of Fairfax are in Alexandria. I don't want to get into the politics of that, but we need to be clear whether they are in Fairfax County or the city of Alexandria. So there's some things we need to do there with project location. And then there are a couple of projects at the bottom, which actually, just the way the timeline worked, were appropriately included in what we call the build network, a future network of 429 projects. At the time we put the project list together, but as we approach adoption of the plan, those projects now actually miraculously qualify to be in the no build because they're actually underway, fully funded, whatever. So for that, consultants have done a little bit of extra modeling work just to make sure, although the impacts are relatively small, we don't want to miss a few percent here and there. So that there's some corrections being made there. It's unfortunate, it's no one's fault, it just happened over that time period. And then the final one here, the interactive map. This is a wonderful new tool we created this time. We didn't have this 5 years ago. It's not part of the adoption of the plan. It's a tool to help understand the plan. But because of that role, we want to make sure that it's consistent. So those 3, all those changes I mentioned with the project list will need to get addressed in the interactive map. And also there's another searchable table of projects. We want to make sure they're all consistent with any changes we make to the official project list document. But it's in one project situation, as we were going through checking some comments, we realized that the western terminus of the project is in the wrong place. So it doesn't affect the way the plan works or the project list works, but we did want to make sure the interpretation using the interactive map was corrected. It just shifts the western terminus a short distance, not a big change. I only have one other slide. So if I may, I'll just take it and then,
Okay.
I just want to say, if those are the extent of the comments you got, you did one heck of a job first time through.
well,
Having
thank you.
done reports of this size and this much analysis, those are very few significant comments.
Yeah, thank you. We skim through everything here, and it's obviously there's a lot more to it. Certainly, if you just skim through the slides at the end of the presentation pack, you can get an overview of the comments that we give received. We've tried to embrace as much as we can, and where we know we're not going to be able to embrace it, we want to explain why we're not able to embrace it. There are some comments that we won't ever be able to really probably address, when it gets down to opposing the inclusion of a particular project that was partially funded through the last 6-year program. We understand those sorts of sensitivities do exist, and we respect that people make those comments, but the inclusion of that project or not in transaction doesn't make any difference to the concerns that they're raising. So there's not a lot we can do in some of those cases. In terms of the activities and schedule, well, we just down to the last 3 bullets now, and this meeting is really the first of the full 22 bullet, which is to finalise the plan project list based on what we heard, feedback from the committees. Next month we'll come to you with a final draft, hopefully for your endorsement, and then subject to that and what happens at the other committees in November, we'll go to NVTA in December, requesting adoption in whatever its final form is at that stage.
I'll ask the question that we've been asking since we began this technical advisory committee. Will we be able to get that final draft in advance of the meeting?
We plan, in fact, more than plan, we will send it to you at least 1 week before your 1 week. Okay. I can't be
More than a day.
Yeah, but that's what we'll do. We kind of got to get past the PCAC committee next Wednesday before we can really turn the screws on the consultant to get it done. But they understand the schedule and constraints, and they said they could do it. I mean, the things that they can work on already, they're already working on. But some of it depends on feedback. You'll get it 1 week out, and we'll send it to all 3 committees at the same time.
First time.
And your next meeting is virtual.
Okay.
Well, we've scheduled it to be virtual. I think we kind of have to make it virtual because PCAC is meeting the same night. It's not their regular night. That's when their regular night is the day before
Schedule it the
Thanksgiving.
way we did.
Yeah. So your meeting will be 7 o'clock on its 3rd Wednesday as per normal. But we're scheduling the PCAC to be like 5 o'clock that evening. So hopefully we'll get that meeting done before the meeting starts. Okay, that's it. Sorry.
Never too late to
Okay.
provide suggestions.
Yeah, just some suggestions. So I think the idea to focus on the findings and assumptions instead of technical details, it's going to be very helpful to convince. I think another thing that may be helpful to make the results more transparent and help people better understand it too, is to briefly comment on what is the implication for your 3 scenarios. So for example, if you are going to assume, there are 2 extremes. You assume if there is no adoption of new EVs, it's going to be 1.7% increase in the total carbon emissions. So, but if we go along the current trajectory, I'm sure every year you have some kind of increase of EV adoption. So if we go along the current trajectory, what would be the penetration in 2045? So that help you to better position your scenarios with relative like new futures. If along that trajectory is going to be 30% of EV versus your current assumption, which is 1%, 2%, I don't know, then people probably can better have better image about what that look like. And another suggestion is, for example, for your current action scenarios for the incentive and pricing, what would be the requirement for that to happen, right? Does it require everyone to have Easy Pass or some smartphone app installed? So we understand those three scenarios, but we don't know the implication of that. So people cannot evaluate how likely and unlikely that scenario is going to be the scenario. I think some kind of briefing discussion about that would be very helpful.
May I respond? Please do.
Sorry, for the EV also the charging station. So if you assume a full adoption of EV, how many kilowatts of electricity are going to consume, and how many new charging stations you have to build to make that happen. If we have a rough idea, then people can probably have a better educated guess.
Well, I think these are good suggestions, and we will give some serious thought to this. And it's kind of the way we're going as well. And I mentioned like a tabular format, where we perhaps be a bit clearer on what the assumptions are and what the impacts would be, and some of the other things that would need to happen. What I want to be careful of is that we don't use transaction as a tool to start promulgating transportation policy, because I don't think it was not created to do that. I think we need to decide how far we want to take this conversation within transaction versus outside of transaction. And so I don't know exactly where that line is, but I have a pretty good idea of when we will cross that line. So in talking about pricing and incentives, I think it's appropriate to give a flavor of what that would mean. But if ultimately it's up to NVTA members to decide if they'd like us to do more on that. But that would have to be a decision they take after they adopt transaction, rather than as part of transaction, because it would need a lot more analysis, I think, to do that. It'd take a lot more time to do that right. And to be perfectly honest, I wouldn't want the region to misfire on such an approach, because it will be very easy for a lot of folks to focus on the pricing part of it and say, this is just government taxation gone crazy, and completely overlook the incentives part of it, which is where you're really going to, you need both pricing and incentives to create change. So, we need to have a very comprehensive discussion about that, which I think is going to be way too deep for transaction to do. So for us, it's like we need to explain what we did and what we learned and what we recommend even, but we can't do the work that will be involved in actually delivering transportation policy built around pricing incentives. NVTA alone wouldn't have the answers. We would need to work with so many regional partners to be able to do that anyway. But I do agree, we can do more than we've done.
Yeah, I definitely understand that it's not NVTA's job to make those future happen. I just think something help you to better understand what does it mean, because it's one of the three scenarios it presented. So likely, unlikely, how realistic that's going to be the future.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Anything else, committee?
I'd like to add on to that. I think that's a great idea in terms of looking more in the long range, but I think some of the conversation, I may have said this before, but I think we're kind of selling the transaction plan a little bit too short in terms of its impact and influence on how jurisdictions are looking within our boundaries are looking at how they address transportation. And I think through this plan, it would help municipalities and their residents to be able to identify more strategic transportation projects. But this project, if this plan is very complicated, very complex, and to add on to what was said is, if we can figure out a way to express some of these concepts in a more clear and easier to understand information, we're going out for community input, but I'm quite sure a lot of people don't understand 90% of what they're commenting on. So, that would be really helpful. I think within the scenario planning, I think we should give it more credence and allow that to help guide these decisions on what, as we move forward and how these reports are written. And even giving some of these basic information, such as this is the funding gap and this is how it impacts your region. And this is how, our projects are helping to lower our greenhouse, the emissions or the carbon pollution and those types of things. So, and in addition, and then I know I was putting notes, I saved them all up for one big word. And then there's one other piece in which when we were talking about the scenario planning, it seems as if we're just doing the planning in 5-year increments without really looking at, we've got a really great what can I say? Historical data from the past that we should be looking at it that this is cumulative. We're building on this. We've got 5 years. How do we take the information that we heard from the community? How do we look at those historical trends that we've identified and incorporate it into the next 5 years? Because it seems as if we lose a lot of information every time we're rebuilding the action plan. And I think I already went over that. How do we better define those funding gaps and what does that mean to the region? And I think, I hear you, it may not be something that we can get into the report, but it's very important that we don't lose a lot of these things that we've identified, we've discussed, we've heard as we move into the next.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. It's this temptation, I guess, that this is a big effort that lasts for 2 years, and then we stand down for 3 years, and we come back and we start again from scratch. We perhaps didn't help ourselves this time. We changed our consultant team. We changed the model that we're using. And we invested in a model that I think is better for NVTA and the region. So that was an important thing that we did, but we're kind of still dealing with the aftershock of changing our model. But I think, to the bigger point, transactional shouldn't end when it's adopted. That's an important milestone because it becomes that eligibility filter for projects that we fund. But on the other hand, you're right. We shouldn't lose that knowledge base that's been put together, and we should be looking to apply the knowledge, for things beyond transaction, probably things beyond the 6-year program as well. So one of the things that we're hoping that we will be looking at is that regional BRT system that I mentioned. As at the moment, transaction is just words. We want it to be action. And so, we're hoping to get support from the authority to actually kind of begin to think about what, a deployment plan for a BRT regional system would actually look like, and begin to build some consensus and detailed thinking on the path to implementation. So it's something a bit like what we did with our transportation technology strategic plan, which was to say, that there's something which is important to transaction, but it's got a life outside of transaction as well. And I think what you're saying is along similar lines, and a regional BRT system would be the the next thing I think that we would need to pick up and run with, hopefully going forward, so that, you know, when we talk about conceptually how it might be useful, we want to actually go on to say that this is actually how it would be done. So I think you make good points.
And then I have one final one, I forgot this one, in which we, legislation that mandates the transaction plan versus the COG. And I think because of our Virginia code, we don't really change that. So I think even though that's what we're looking at, we should make sure we're not really pigeonholing ourselves to legislation that was written a couple decades ago versus what we're actually real-time living. So how do we try to balance that until the Virginia codes are updated to match what we're going on? I hope we don't lose that energy just because the Virginia code is written. And I know there's some legality, and I'm not an attorney or anything like that, but I just do hope we don't get in that mindset where we pigeonhole ourselves to something that was written. Doesn't matter.
And then, I'm sorry, this is Monica. Randy, excuse me, Chairman Boyce, may I chime in, please?
Please do.
Thank you, and thank you for that, Karen. I think what you say make a lot of sense if Virginia was the only funding entity. And we have to be mindful, and we have to remind ourselves that transaction is not meant to fund. We fund all modes of transportation except air travel. So that's the first thing. And then NVTA is not the only funding entity. So when we talk about the way the legislation is written versus what COG is doing versus what the Commonwealth is doing for VTrans, all of these long-range plans that are going on, we have to keep in mind that transaction purposely is fiscally and geographically unconstrained. I don't think the legislation pinholes us because we have projects in Maryland, we have projects in the district. We cannot fund those. And the way tax code is set up, we will not be able to fund those. And I don't think you will get a change in legislation to fund projects with NOVA monies that are not generated or projects that don't have a direct benefit to Northern Virginians. So I think we have to be careful in that. We try to the extent possible incorporate the work that COG has done because I have these conversations a lot because people say, oh, transaction is a funding document. It is not. Oh, should the legislation be changed to match what or better align with what? So I just want to put that out there just to remind everyone, the long range plan and some of these projects will not come to fruition for another 20, 25 years. Some we will see in the next update of the 6-year program. But my main point is NVTA is not the sole funding entity. I know some people would like us to be, but we're not. And this doesn't work. When I say this, the planning for our region doesn't work if we work in silos. So we do work with our regional partners. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Any other questions?
That was my last one.
All right. Monica, you're up on the agenda unless you're back on vacation right now.
Well, I'm trying. I don't have anything else to add. I do want to thank you all for hanging in there with us for this. Again, I know most of you, and I say most, are leaving work to come and participate in this committee. So we are truly, truly appreciative. We are trying to evolve with transaction with each transaction, making sure we hear from all of the community and making sure that we have a good balance of what we're hearing from the community, what the analysis is telling us, and then what does it mean for the projects that are submitted as part of the 6-year program. So I do want to thank you for that. The last thing I will say, we are working on our legislative program for 2023. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but there is a balance of $38.5 million left to get to the full restoration of the authority from 2018. when $102 million annually was diverted for Metro's state of good repair needs. We are continually seeking to be made whole completely, and we want to make sure the revenue stream is protected. And Mr. Chair, that's all I have.
Thank you, Ms. Backman. And let's get that funding back to NVTA. Unless there's anything else, we will make a motion to adjourn. Anybody seconded? All right, good.